In this video, I'm going to go over my process for editing videos in Lightroom. I use Lightroom Classic, and I'll explain the difference in the regular Lightroom app versus Lightroom Classic. I'll also show how I manage my files and folder structures to organize the photos. And then also we will import them into Lightroom and we'll work through the process of editing. So these are going to be for real estate photos, but I use similar practices for other styles of photography as well. So these are some of the real estate photos that I've edited on a recent project, just as an example. But I'll go ahead and close this out. And what I've done is I have inserted my SD card. So we have our SD card here. And then the second window is my hard drive that I work off of. So this is an external hard drive that I have all of my client folders and projects that I'm working off of currently. I usually try and do this off of my main device just in case of any hardware failure on that device, or also just to be able to be more mobile if I need to jump over to another system and have all my files there. But a third reason would be just to not fill up the hard drive on my main computer, since I do have several projects that I'm usually working on at any given time. So what we want to start out with is opening up our memory card and looking at our files. So these are some sample photos just from Christmas, but what we want to do is we want to change the view so we can sort what kind of files they are. So typically these would be sorted in a different way where you're staggering through JPEG and RAWs. So if you just click over here, and it's similar on a Mac or a Windows PC, but if you sort by the file type, and then you can select the first JPEG and then scroll down to the last JPEG and just hold Shift and click, and that's going to allow you to select all of those at once to drag over to our folder on our external hard drive. So the way I structure those folders is go into the clients folder, and for real estate photography, I would create one folder for that property, that address. You could do the same thing for a client name or whatever the photo shoot is. So for this example, we're going to use real estate, so I just make one folder for that address, and then within that folder I do a JPEG folder and a RAW folder. So this is just going to allow us to pull in all of our files off of our memory card, so we have them on our hard drive and we can work with them. So the first thing we want to do is select all of our JPEGs from our memory card, and we want to go ahead and open the JPEG folder, and we'll drag those over and drop them into the JPEG folder. I'm not going to do that because these are just example files. And then same thing with the RAW files. We'll go back and we'll select the first RAW file, and we'll scroll to the last RAW file, hold Shift and click, and that's going to allow us to select everything, and then we'll make sure we're inside of our RAW folder, and we'll drag and drop those in. So now we have all of our RAW files and our JPEGs separate. Usually I just keep the JPEGs around as a fallback, but we're going to edit with our RAW files because that gives us more data, uncompressed data to work with within Lightroom. So now that we've pulled our files off of our memory card, it's probably a good idea to leave those on your memory card for a little while if you can afford to. If you have additional cards, I would leave them on there as a backup for now, at least until you have 2 copies of these somewhere. So if you need to clear your hard drive, or if you need to clear your memory card rather, I would take, once you have these folders full on your hard drive, I would copy these off to another location. So one thing would be iCloud Drive, if you use that, or a Dropbox maybe. But basically that would back up these files to an external location, preferably cloud storage if possible. That way it's not located in the same place. It's on an external hard drive, an external device, in case there are any issues and a hard drive crashes or anything like that. Another good option that I use as well is Backblaze. So I'll have a link to Backblaze and any other resources in the video description, so you can check that out. Backblaze will back everything up, so it's not going to be an instant backup. You will still want to leave these on the memory card, say overnight, and let your computer stay connected to the internet, but it'll automatically push all these files up to Backblaze. And in the case that you did have a hard drive go bad or anything like that, anything that has been backed up to Backblaze, and as you can see, it's $7 a month. Anything that's been backed up to Backblaze, including external hard drives, can be restored easily. They have options to download files. So in this case, if we're just talking about a couple folders worth of images, you could go right in your Backblaze dashboard and download those files again if you needed to. If your whole hard drive crashed and you needed, terabytes worth of data back, they actually will send you a hard drive with all of your files on it to be able to restore to your PC or Mac, and then send that hard drive back to them. So for $7 a month, this is really good peace of mind just for any of your files in general, just making sure everything's backed up and taken care of. But I just want to make sure that I illustrate that. If we were to pull all of these files onto the folders here and then delete the memory card, and this was the only place that those files existed, then we're at the mercy of this hard drive not failing, not crashing, which I've had hard drives crash before, and it's something that you don't want to have to go back out and reshoot, and waste a lot of time. And some things, depending on what the files are, maybe it's a wedding, things more important than just real estate photos that can be reshot. Some things can't be reshot. So you just want to make sure that you have multiple copies of these on different hard drives, preferably in different locations. If you can, use a cloud storage or something like that. So now that we have our files moved over, like I say, we're going to be working with the raw files, and we're going to be pulling those into Lightroom Classic. And I'll show you the difference, or I'll explain the difference here. There is the Lightroom, which is a desktop version of the Lightroom app, essentially. So this has a lot of the same features as Lightroom Classic, but one of the most important features that Lightroom does not have, and it's the reason we're going to use Lightroom Classic, is Lightroom does not have the option to leave your files in place, which means leaving the files inside this folder. Lightroom does not have the option to leave your files in place when importing them in to edit. Basically, that's going to make a second copy of these photos, all of these raw photos. When you import them into Lightroom, it's going to make a second copy of all of these inside the Lightroom folder, the Lightroom archive. So for me, it doesn't make sense to use Lightroom. I don't want to have multiple files. I don't want to mess up my folder structure here either. I want to be able to have this property in my client folder that I can come back to and know where the files are. I don't want everything in Lightroom's folder personally. I like being able to leave the files here, and Lightroom Classic will allow you to leave those files in place, and it will add them to the Lightroom library without copying them over. So one thing to be aware of, if you are using Lightroom Classic and you have these files on an external hard drive like I do, um, if you go into Lightroom Classic and you try and work with these files and that hard drive is not connected, these files won't be found. So you do have to make sure that your hard drive is connected that has the files that you want to work with. So with that said, we're going to be working with Lightroom Classic. And I'll just readjust this window a little bit. So now once we're inside Lightroom Classic, we want to go down to Import. And what I want to point out is if you are on so one thing I want to point out is so one important thing I want to point out is in order to copy these files in place, you need to select the Add option. I want to make sure to point this out right now that the Add option is grayed out. There's no way to access this. The reason for that is because we have our SD card selected over here. Lightroom is smart enough to know that we don't want to add photos in place from an SD card that is most likely going to be removed and reused in the camera. So it doesn't give you the option to add. If you're pulling them off the memory card, you would have to make a copy on the hard drive first. So if you come in and you're intending to add, like I'm getting ready to show you, and you ever find that these are grayed out, realize that you probably have external media, meaning an SD card selected. Now, an external hard drive will allow you to click on the Add option. So I'm going to dive down in here to my client folder where I have those files. And we're going to look at the raw folder. Now you see that the Add option is available. I've done that before, and it has taken me a while to realize sometimes what's going on and why can't I add files. If that ever happens, it's just because you've got an SD card selected over here instead of the location that we pulled those files into on an actual hard drive. So what I'm going to do for this is I am just going to pull all these in. We've got some bracketed photos here that we will do HDR with. So all of the files here are files that I want to work with. So I'm just going to leave all these checked, and you can do all photos up here. By default, it's already checked. And let's see, there's some options over here I might want to change. One thing is probably go ahead and select lens correction. And what it's going to do is it's going to recognize from the EXIF data that is associated with these photos. Lightroom is going to pull which lens was used for these photos, and it's going to automatically apply lens correction. So if there's any distortion in that lens and vignetting around the edges just naturally, Lightroom will correct for that, and it'll flatten out some of that distortion and brighten up any vignetting. So it is a good idea to go ahead and leave lens correction turned on. And let's add this to a collection, and we're going to go ahead and create a new collection. And let's see, let's look at our folder name. And I'm just going to copy this so everything is consistent. And then I'm going to paste it in here. So I'm going to have a collection by the same name. And then I'm going to set as the target collection. So that means all these files that I'm adding are going to go into that collection. So we'll go ahead and hit add. Oh, well, make sure add. So we'll make sure add is selected, and then we have everything we need here. Correct. You can add keywords if you need to. I could add the property address if that's helpful. I typically don't mess with that, and just import the photos. Okay, so now that all of your images have imported, the first thing we're going to do is to check the lens correction profile to make sure that that was properly applied. So let's select our first image. I'll double click on that, and I'm going to select the Develop tab and scroll down here to Lens Correction. So now I see that the lens corrections did not apply. The reason for that is because the lens that we used was a full manual lens, which means that there are no electronics on the lens to communicate back to the camera, letting the camera know what lens was attached when this photo was taken. So if you're using a lens with autofocus, Lightroom will have the information to be able to pull in to apply any needed corrections for that specific lens. And what that's going to correct is any distortion and vignetting around the edges. So we can change this here, but that's only going to apply to one image. We want it to apply to all the images. So what we can do is hold Control, select one image, hold Control A to select all the images, and turn on this sync button. So now auto sync will make any changes that we make apply to every image that's selected. So aside from the lens correction, if I came up and adjusted the exposure, it's going to adjust the exposure on every image. So we do want to come back and turn this off once we have applied our lens correction. But right now, let's just, we've got everyone selected and we've got auto sync turned on. So we're going to select our lens, which was a Samyang 12mm f2, and that's also listed under Rokinon. They're the exact same lens. But yeah, so that's all of the settings that we need. And auto sync is turned on, so that's going to synchronize across all of the images because we made that change with auto sync turned on. So now if we go to the next image, you can see as we tab through these, all of these have had the lens profile applied. So before we start making any other changes, we're going to turn off auto sync, and we can even go back into library and just make sure that we only have one image selected, so we're not applying all of our changes to all of our images. So the library is just going to show you all of the files that were imported and that are inside of this collection that we're working in right now. You have some view options down here at the bottom. You can look at one photo at a time. You can look at the grid. So if I have a specific photo selected and I change it to the single photo, it's going to switch to that. I can also double click and it'll do the same, automatically switch over. There's some different options here with comparing two photos. Primarily we're just going to look at the grid, and then every now and then we may look into specific photos, especially once we get into editing. But then also that's where we get onto the Develop tab. So with that photo selected and then selecting the Develop tab, it's going to allow us to start making some edits to these photos. So let's go back to the library view. So right now I can't go back to that grid because I'm on Develop. So I need to go back to the library, and now I can see my grid again. So the first thing I want to do, this is personally how I sort through all of these photos and kind of get an idea of which ones are the best and which ones I'm going to use for the edits, especially since we have all these bracketed shots. It can get kind of overwhelming because there's just so many of them, and so many of them are almost not usable, but may be helpful once we start doing some HDR stuff. What we can do to narrow down the photos and find out which ones that we think that we're most likely to use. What I do typically is I go in and flag. So this is a selection flag. I'll flag the photos that I think are a pretty good chance that we'll use those photos. So the first run through, I'll flag those photos. Then the second run through, I will filter and I will turn and only show the flagged photos. So I'll only show the photos that I flagged. And then once I select the flagged photo and start editing, I will use another method of filtering. So I have this photo flagged that I'm going to use it. I've done some editing. I'll use the stars to filter after that. So once I've done a little bit of editing, but maybe I think I might come back and tweak it a little more, I'll typically give it, maybe a 3-star rating, not a 5-star rating. So if I've done some editing on it and I think I might come back and take another look at it, I'll give it a 3-star rating. When I'm completed with it and I know it's done and I'm going to use it for sure, I'll give it a 5-star rating. So that way, in the end, we can come back and we can filter, and we can filter by the star rating and only look at the 5 stars. Or if I want to find all of those photos that I had rated as a 3-star that maybe still need a little bit of editing, then I can filter by 3-star ratings and find all the files that I still need to finish editing. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and clear this out, and we'll start going through and marking these with a flag, the ones that I think are most likely to be used before we even touch the developing side of things. So we'll stay on the library, and I'm just going to double click into the photo and say, I know this isn't one I'm going to use, so I'm definitely not going to flag it. I can use a negative flag, so this is a pick and this is a not pick. So I can flag that and say, I definitely know I'm not going to use that file, just to give myself a clue that so if it's like this and I can't necessarily see that bag's there, I can tell, I already know I'm not using that file. So, but what I'm going to do is go through here and on these so what I'll do is go through, and on these brackets, I'll typically select the one that looks like it's the best exposure, because sometimes we may not need to use the other brackets and make an HDR. Sometimes this exposure will be enough once we get into the develop side, and we can tweak it and make it look good enough that we don't really need the extra data that would come with combining those multiple brackets into an HDR. So this one's not bad. I'll go ahead and flag it. We may end up using that one. Let's see. So we'll go back and look at the next one. So these definitely need straightened up a bit. They're I feel like it's crooked, but it's the direction that the camera was angled. But we'll look at that's a possibility. It's a definite possibility. So another thing with these brackets that we can do to expedite, instead of going back and forth between these views, I can select and say yes. I'll go ahead and use that, and then I can use my arrow keys. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gets me to the next photo that is at a good level, light level. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that that one looks good. So then I can use my arrow keys again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now 5. Okay, so that one gets me to a good light level. And we'll probably use that one. So this is one where the windows are really blown out. But if you look at these brackets, this is kind of dark. This one might be able to be brought up a bit and be usable without bracketing together. But probably what I'll do is try and just bracket 2 photos. So maybe, probably won't need this one. I would probably bracket this photo and this photo together. But we don't want to do any of that yet because that's going to just slow down our workflow. We just want to go through right now and find the good photos that we think are at least close to the exposure we're going to use, because we can start tweaking on that. So maybe I'll flag that one instead of this one, because I feel like this one is too blown out. We definitely lost data there. We have good data in these windows, and we still have good data here. We might have enough that we can bring this up and make it bright enough that it'll be usable without pulling a second frame in to an HDR. So about 5 clicks of the arrow will get me to the next good exposure. Yeah, 5. So that makes things a little quicker. So I can basically just run through these and flag 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 on that one. Flag, that one looks good. 5, yeah, it's a pretty good shot. And some of these we may not end up using. I may decide I don't like this angle. Maybe I like the next one that I shot better. Not the same. But we may decide that we like this angle better than even using this angle, and that's fine. We'll filter that out in the end. But I'm going to go ahead and flag it anyway. That way I can go ahead and get all of them edited and have the best of the best to choose from. So I'm just going to continue through and flagging the ones that I think will be most likely to be used. So this process really helps things go faster. Batching things together, going through and making a first selection, and then going through and editing, and then going through a final edit, I've found to really speed up the process of editing. So this one, we could clone that out, but I'm going to go ahead and pass on that. I don't necessarily have to like down flag that, because it's not going to show up when I filter and filter by this flag. So it really doesn't matter. I don't have to do that. I'm just going to skip it for now. And one thing I do want to watch for is, I remember we had a reflection in this area. This is a good shot because all you can see is the camera, but I do remember there being a reflection there that I remember thinking could be kind of subtle on editing, and I wanted to watch for it. So just something to keep in mind as well when you're going through these. If you had anything like that that you kind of remember happened, it might be good to just watch for that. So I'm going to continue through. So I'm just using the arrow keys back and forth to find what I think is the best. Definitely not that. Yeah, let's grab one of these. It's pretty good. Okay, so this is a better shot than the one we had earlier with all the bags on the countertop. So this is a good shot. It says might be a better shot because I readjusted and I have the whole window in here. So let me go back and see. Yeah, I definitely like the other one better. So I'm going to unflag this just so in the end I have less to sort through because I do definitely like this one better. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one instead. Sometimes I'm picking the brighter and sometimes I'm picking the darker. It really just depends on the shot. Like this one, I wouldn't pick the brighter, even though I like the way this looks better. Obviously, you're losing a lot of data here in the windows, to where if you go for the darker, we may be able to bring these floors and everything up without a second bracket to add for an HDR. So I would go for the darker one just to see if that's the case. Really though, the first run through, we're just trying to find the best shots. Like this one, I think I squared things up a little bit better than the previous one. I think I felt like this was a little off, so I reshot another set of brackets with a little bit more square. The lines are a little more square on that one, so I'm going to select that one instead. Definitely not going to select these. So what did I do here? I've got two shots. May have just taken a second one as a safety shot. I think I had my focal point up here. Slightly different framing on that. I think I like this framing better, which is the one I selected. Make sure, did I select both? Yeah, let's unselect that, just because I like the framing of the second one better. You get over here, you got a little room over here. And yeah, I think that's just framed up a little better. Now we get this one, it's a little brighter. So really I'm just trying to get through these as quick as possible, flagging all the ones that I think we're going to use, or at least close to the ones that I think we're going to use. It may be a different exposure. We may decide to do an HDR on some of them. Basically just working through and getting all these flagged. And again, just using the left and right arrow keys to work my way through. Okay, and that's the end. So now we've made it all the way through in just a few minutes, and we've gotten all the ones flagged that we most likely are going to use. So we've gone from having 411 photos to go through to, let's look at just the flagged. So now we've got 75. So we've gone from 411 photos to 75 photos. That's much more manageable. So now we're going to go through and see if we can edit these 75 photos. And any of the photos that we have trouble with, like some of the ones where maybe it's going to be a little darker in the foreground, but we want to keep the window lights, then we can turn off our flag filter and see the brackets that are around that photo and make a decision on creating an HDR out of that photo possibly. So let's just go ahead and start with the first photo. And so we've got it selected, but we don't have any options over here to change the brightness or anything like that because we need to be on the Develop tab. So we're still on the Library tab. So we're going to click over to Develop. So the first thing you can try is auto, and that actually did a pretty good job. So we'll try auto. You can use Command Z to undo if you do something and you want to undo that. So you can kind of toggle between the two. I actually like the auto settings. One thing, I think it's the direction that this was shot at. It looks crooked. And in order to fix that, what we can do is we can go into the crop settings and we can change the angle. And basically, if we go back to 0, what I'm looking at here is this line and the side of the door frame. So in order to make it look a little straighter, we can just change that rotation and square that up a little better. So see, these lines are a little more square. And then if I need to move it left or right, so I probably wouldn't leave it cropped like that. I would move it over this direction so you have a little extra room. But I can go ahead and say I'm done with that, and that looks better. I like the way that looks. If there's anything else that you want to tweak about the image, you can come in and adjust the exposure and contrast. I think auto did a really good job on this one. Something like this with this intricate details, you could increase the texture and clarity a little bit, maybe even dehaze. Dehazing is going to also add some contrast as well. So if dehazing, it's going to give you more detail, but it's also going to add some contrast. So if you feel like it's too much contrast, but you like the detail, you can kind of dial those things back a little on some of the other sliders. So maybe bring some of the shadows up to get rid of some of that contrast, some of that darkness that was brought in by the dehaze slider. So I think that looks pretty good. So we will go ahead and say that this one is done. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and say that this one's done. So we'll switch over to library to bring our star rating back. And I'll go ahead and make that a 5-star because I don't think we're going to need to do anything else to that photo. So I'm just going to go to the next photo. I don't even know if I like this one that well. Let's check it on develop and just do an auto adjust. Maybe make it a little brighter. I don't like how cool the lighting is outside versus how warm the lighting is inside. I just feel like there's a bit of a disconnect there. I just don't know if this is a good shot. So personally, I'm going to say this probably doesn't add anything to the property. So I'm just going to remove it from our selection. I like this shot better. So we've got the front door, and then we have coming in the front door. So let's try and do a develop on this one, and we'll start with auto. And then I'm just going to tweak some things. Well, that looks pretty good. I like that. So one thing I have to remember is to click back over and say, I think I'm done with that one. I'm going to make it a 5-star. And we'll do the same thing. We'll go over to develop. We'll do auto. And we'll make some tweaks. These are roughly similar tweaks that I'm making, but for these past 3 photos, the lighting is so drastically different on them, we can't copy and paste all the settings. So I will show you how to copy and paste settings when we get to some that are very similar, but that's just not something that would work out real well for these. So one thing I can do, because I have a lot of like vignetting on the side here, when I make it dim enough for the chandelier to look good, there's a lot of vignetting going on here. What I can do is I can make it a little brighter to get rid of some of that vignetting. And in order to bring some detail back to this chandelier, I can do a spot adjust. So there's some new tools, luminance range. I would probably just start with a radial gradient and create a new mask. And I'm just gonna put a mask over this. And that way the edits that I make here are only going to apply to this section of the photo. So this is a good example of a spot adjustment. So I can just take this exposure, I don't want to bring it down too much and make it look unnatural. But if we make this a little wider and then bring the exposure down a little, maybe we leave the exposure about where it is and look at playing with the shadows. Yeah, so if we bring these shadows down and then the highlights, and bring a lot of detail back into that. And then I can also use the dehaze like we were, bring some detail, but you see you can take it to the extreme and see how dark it's making things. So we just want to do a little bit, but there's still a little bit of a dark halo there, so I want to bring these highlights back up a little. And then if I click back out of that, now I'm back into my full editing the full image, not just the spot. Then I can adjust things, make them a little brighter, but still keeping the detail here. So now if I needed to go back and edit this again, I can just select the spot select, and that spot is still there. I can just click on it and make those changes, click back out of the spot, and now again I'm editing the full image. So that spot edit is a very helpful option. So let's jump back over to library on this photo, and we'll say we're done with that photo. And on to the next one. So this is a really good photo. It's very well lit already, so we probably aren't going to have to do a lot with it. We jump over to develop and hit auto. That's really good right there. Personally, I might increase, I think the exposure, but probably what I'm going to want to do is decrease the shadows. So I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit, the brightness in the shadows up a little bit. And then on the highlights, you can see the windows, the highlights in the windows. If I bring those down, I'm going to get a little more detail out here and a little more detail around the lights. So I think that looks pretty good. I like the texture just a little bit. I like to bump those a little bit. Maybe the clarity, not too much though. One thing I would probably do on a room like this, because it's so warm, one thing you can do is decrease some of your vibrance and saturation. But also you have your color temperature. We could play around with bringing a little bit more cool light into it. Basically, we just want to make it look a little more natural, just more how the room actually looks when you're standing in it. Because I don't think the room was this warm. So I would cool it off a little bit, but not too much. You don't want to kill the wood vibes. So I think right about there is pretty natural. That looks pretty good. Yep. So I think on that I would call that done, and we'll jump to the next one. So now, this being the same room, you would think maybe you could copy the settings over to here, but because of the exposure difference, the level, I don't think it's going to work real well, but we can try it and see what it looks like. So one thing we can do on that is, so I'm just jumping out from the single view to the grid view, and it still has the photo selected that I was on. So if I select that, and then Command C is going to copy those settings, and then I can select that and Command V. Oh, I guess it doesn't. So let's see. This is a slight difference between Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. Okay. So if I want to try and copy these settings over, where is that option? Oh, settings. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if I want to try and copy the settings from this photo over to this photo, I'll go back to this photo, hover over settings, and then copy settings. So now it's going to give me a list of all the options that we can copy. Most of the options that are selected by default are what you're going to want to use. Sometimes you'll use a spot removal tool, like if we were to remove something from a frame, like this wall outlet, for instance. We wouldn't necessarily want to copy that to the next photo, because there's not going to be something in that same spot that you're going to want to remove. So that's why some of these are left unchecked. So we're going to copy the settings from here and go to the next one, and we're going to paste those settings. And so because of the drastic difference in lighting between these two photos, that didn't work well. So that's an example of when copying settings is not a good idea. So for this one, we'll do auto, and let's see if we can get this to look the way we want without making it a bracket shot, an HDR shot using the brackets. So I'm going to bring the highlights all the way down so I can push my exposure up a little higher. And I'm also going to push my shadows up as well so I can get as much brightness in these dark areas. And that's actually looking pretty good even without bracket shots. So we already have our dehaze, clarity, and texture set from before when we pasted our settings over. So we might want to back these off a little bit just because they will bring some additional contrast and darkness. So we might want to bring the dehaze back some. If you bring the clarity back too far, it actually makes it a little hazy. So you just want to kind of keep that around the middle of the slider. But that's actually looking pretty good right there. Another thing that you can do, in addition to decreasing your vibrance and saturation on a shot with a lot of warmth or just too much of a certain color, is you can go into your HSL settings and change your hue, saturation, and luminance. So we could say saturation, we could decrease the saturation only on the yellow, which I kind of like, maybe about halfway. That's not bad. But let's make sure that that looks consistent with the previous shot. I actually might want to bring a little bit of that yellow down, and even maybe some of the orange down from that wood. So as you see, there's really no blue in this frame. So if I change the blue, it doesn't change much. If I push it to the extremes, you can kind of see some of the cooler light over here getting amplified. But that just kind of shows how the individual colors can be isolated on the saturation, but then also on the luminance. If you want to make all the things that are yellow or orange brighter, you can take the orange and make those areas brighter or darker. So I can push just the orange areas a little brighter, and actually that might help us on the next photo if we take those orange areas and make them a little brighter. And sometimes if you can't really tell what's going on, if it's doing much, I'll just run it all the way up and down and just see exactly what areas that slider's affecting. So I think that's pretty good. So one thing I need to remember here is to jump back over to library. I've already set my 5 stars on this one. I need to set that one. And actually, this would be a good example to say, you know, we might come back. That's a little darker than this. We might come back and do an HDR on this. So I'm going to leave it as a 3 star. So at the end, I can filter that and see and make a decision on if I do want to go ahead and do an HDR on this shot. So we'll go ahead and switch back over to develop, and we'll try and just run auto first. So this might be a good one to try doing an HDR. So if we undo all the way back, undo the auto settings, this is where we're starting from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to library, and I'm going to go back to my grid, and I'm going to find the highlighted. So this is the file we're working on right here. So let's turn off the flags and just turn off the filters. So this is still highlighted. So this is the shot we're looking at right here. So I need the detail from that light, but I also want to bring some brightness to this foreground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Command, and I'm going to select a second photo. I don't want to add this one because there's just too much blown out. There's a lot of data lost there. And same here, this one's too dark. There's a lot of data lost in these darker areas. So I'm just going to try with these two. And if I hover over and right click, and then go to Photo Merge, just highlight over that, and then HDR. So it's going to start to compile my photos into an HDR. Auto align, auto settings, deghosting amount. We're not going to have much of a ghosting on these because they were shot on a tripod, so you're not going to have much there. probably not going to need any of that, but you can even run it up to high and you probably won't see any visible difference on the preview. You can turn an overlay on. Most of the stuff I don't mess with, because if you just leave it on the default settings, it does a really good job. So I'm just going to merge those two, and it's creating my new file. So from these two, we have a new file created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure this is my original flagged file. I'm going to unflag that, and I'm going to flag the new one, because this is the one I want to work with now. So now I can go ahead and change my filter back to flagged, so it's only going to show my flagged files. And let's see, which one were we on? Right here. So now it still looks dark here and bright there, but the HDR will give us more range of adjustments. So let's go ahead and hit, right, it's already done auto when combining the HDR, but so I can bring up my shadows and adjust my highlights, and it doesn't affect, I still have a lot of detail out here in the window. I can bring this up a lot brighter than I could before without losing data in the window, because I have the extra information from combining those two frames. So I'm still going to tweak a little bit here. Brings a little more clarity back here. And then the blacks brings a little more brightness up here. So just working these sliders to find the right amount of everything. So I think that looks pretty good right there, actually. It's pretty close. See what auto does. Looks good. I think that looks pretty good. Might be just slightly warmer than the previous picture. So check the color temperature. Yeah, that looks better. So now let's try and copy the settings from this photo. And we'll go ahead and check all, but I'll remove some of these that were unchecked earlier, because these aren't as common to copy. So I'm just going to copy what's there. And let's just try and paste that. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, that looks really good. Now, whether this photo is used or not, it may not be, but I kind of think I just like the photo without, personally, without the closet view. But as far as the exposure and levels and everything, I think that was a good image to copy settings from this photo to this photo. I think it worked well. And again, this is one that I don't know necessarily will be used, but at least it shows off the closet. I think on that one, just doing an auto setting is sufficient. Let's see, auto setting. Might cool that off just a little, just because of that wall color. I think it comes out a little more yellow than it actually is. So that was pretty similar, so we can copy the settings from this one and paste. Yeah, that's pretty close without even changing anything. So this is very blue. See what auto does for us. Makes it even more blue. So I know those walls are that color. Sometimes it's just what you gotta work with. Try and make it look the best you can. So one thing I could do here is on the saturation, maybe bring that warm light down a little bit so it's not so much of a contrast between the two. So that's where the HSL settings can really help. We could also bring the blue, and we don't want to bring the blue all the way out. We want to make it accurate, but I mean, you also don't want it to be too overdone. So we might leave that right around there and just bring down some of that orange and yellow. So there's no real way to get that out without these focused sliders. So that's a good kind of way to visually see what's going on there. So same thing with those same colors, orange and yellow, we can darken or brighten just that color. So that's not really affecting any of the blue areas. It's only affecting those orange areas of the photo that have that color orange or yellow. So I think that's good. We're mainly just adjusting the saturation there. I think that looks pretty good. I'll try auto on this one. Not bad. It warmed it up a little more than I like. I do like warm, but that just felt a little too much. So now this will be a good one to kind of play around with a little bit of a removal tool here. So you can zoom in, and let's try a healing brush and just see what we can do with a quick swipe. Not too bad. So let's try and see if we can move this white from over here maybe. So let's see, I'm gonna zoom back out. I'm just going to manually zoom in a little. So that actually got rid of the camera pretty well. So now, let's go back into that. And let's adjust this one again. So if I move, so this is my destination and this is the source. So if I move the source, maybe to this piece over here. See if we can get it lined up in a way that looks natural. So that's a little too bright. I move it. See, I feel like it was better right there. Yeah, that's good. So that's not too bad. So obviously it's not perfect. You still have a tripod pole there. We could get rid of that. Maybe we'll just add one more. So I can't add one over top of this one, but I can start just outside of that one and add another piece. And obviously that's not a good source. So we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to bring it down here and try and line it up right like that. That's pretty good. Once you zoom out, there's no more camera. So let's see what else we could do to make this one pop a little more. So the warmth of these contrasting with the cool light coming in, I feel like I want to just pull a little bit of that down, a little bit of that yellow and orange down in the saturation. Not so much that it's unnatural, but just enough to where it matches a little better. And this is going to bug me just a little bit because I'm picky. The way the shadow lines don't line up. So I'm going to go back into that, and I'm going to look at, so there's my destination. I'm going to look at my source. So select it, and then I'm just going to edge this over a little bit, see if we can get those to line up. Just a little more. Is that it? It's definitely better. Yeah, it doesn't look as off. Yeah, I think that's good. We're gonna leave that. I think that looks pretty good. So another trick that I like using is this side of the frame is a bit darker than this side. So we can brighten that up a little bit if we go into our spot settings, and we'll add a linear gradient. So we're just gonna click and drag across the frame. So I'm just gonna click here and drag to the right, and that's gonna add a linear gradient. So I can drop it anywhere, because once I drop it, I can adjust. Make that tighter transition or more graduated transition. So I'll probably try it about there. And just like the spot tool, this gradient tool is going to allow me, while this is selected, to use these sliders to only affect where that gradient is. So I see maybe I want to make it a little bit more gradual. And bring that back. So I can just add a little bit of extra exposure there. You know, change the highlights, however, whatever you need. But that's just a nice little option to use in the case that you need to brighten one side of the photo, but not the photo itself, the whole photo. So I like that. I think that looks good. Looks better. So that's another thing to see down here. If you click on this, you can see the before and after. So you can kind of see. And if you want to do switch sides. So there we go. Okay, let's see. This is the brighter. Yeah, that actually works really well. But it's very warm here and the rest is very cool. So let's try and do what we did in the closet. And we'll go saturation, bring this orange and yellow down just a little bit, just to make it a little, just make it match a little better. I don't want to go all the way because I feel like it's not that white standing in there. I feel like there's a little bit of a warmer glow from that. But I don't think it's as much as it looked like in the photo. I think that's pretty natural right there. Yeah, and that looks good. So here's another, not necessarily a necessity on this photo, but if you wanted to even things out and make this area just slightly darker, since it is brighter from the chandelier light, it's another area you could do. Yeah, quick little linear gradient, and then just bump that down a hair. Yeah, looks good. So let's try, because that's a similar shot, let's try copying these settings. Just trying to mix things up here and give a good example of copying settings over, let you see it a few times in a few different settings. Yeah, that actually works really well. So you see the before and after, and let's see, I'll do left and right, before and after. Looks much better. So we've got this white. You can actually see I was kind of trying to hide behind the curtain there a little bit. So what we can do is we can do a healing brush, make that a little larger, and just paint the corner here and see what happens. Not bad. Obviously there's not half a handle hanging out over here, so we want to change where our source is coming from. See if we can get it in an area that looks a little more natural, and maybe line up the line in the back of the shower. See if we can get that to line up. It's gonna be close. So now there's obviously not a drain there, so what we can do is make another spot remover, and I'm going to move the destination on top of that, and then grab the source just to try and cover some of that up. And this is a little extreme, probably not something I would do on a regular basis, but just to kind of give you an idea of how you can hide things and make them less noticeable, because even though this isn't perfect, it's better than having the white curtain over the front here. It's just less distracting. And again, not something I would do for many photography scenarios, but I think it works okay in this situation. And this is pretty simple. Probably wouldn't spend much more time than hitting auto and maybe a couple quick tweaks. Looks good. Same here. Looks good. Not much to see here. That looks a lot better actually. And again, another example of before and after. Okay, very bright. Let's see. So and this is a good illustration of using raw files. So I'm going to undo that. This is very bright and areas are blown out. There's some really white areas here. If this was a JPEG, these areas that are white would be compressed and you wouldn't have enough data to pull to actually make that usable. But since these are raw files, just simply hitting auto brings those levels back in line, and there's plenty of data even on overexposed and sometimes underexposed frames that are very usable. And I would add a little bit of clarity and texture just because I really like just the marble and all the textures that are going on here. And because that darkened things up a little bit, I'm going to come back and make it a little brighter. And also, let's look at the white balance just a little bit. Too much. Let's see. It might actually just be the saturation overall that I can decrease. Let's try the vibrance since it's 15. Yeah, that looks better. These whites are much cleaner. I think that looks really good. And coming back to this, I mean, you could come in with your spot remover and remove some of this stuff, but I mean, that's there, and unless that's been fixed since we took the photos, you probably want to leave them in just to make sure, client shows up to see the house. It actually looks the way it looked in the photos. So this isn't probably going to be a useful shot for listings, but I like to get these shots just so the homeowners have documentation of water heaters, furnace, stuff like that. So here's one we could try pulling settings from another, but actually I don't think we have any. We don't have any from the kitchen that would be a good example, because we don't want to pull the settings from this one because this was very overexposed, so we had to bring a lot of stuff down to bring this back down to a normal level. So this one is not overexposed, so if we try to use those settings, it's going to make this one just way too dark. So we'll just start out with auto. Go ahead and run these. So you're bringing your highlights all the way down and your shadows all the way up. A lot of times can, especially on a raw file, can kind of mimic high dynamic range because you're actually utilizing the maximum of that dynamic range that's available, and then from there you can adjust exposure accordingly. I think that looks pretty good. Might bring some of this dehaze and clarity and texture in, which is going to darken things a little, so we might brighten that back up a little bit, and that kind of gives me a little bit more of a warm color than I think is accurate. So I'm going to bring that down just a little, but I'm also going to do what I did on the other, and I'm going to bring this vibrance down just a little as well, and maybe even bump these orange and yellows down a little. I feel like that's a little more accurate color. Starting to bring some color out of the floors though, so Might actually leave a little bit more in there. I like that. Looks really good. So now here's another example of where we could darken this window a little bit, because right now if we darken the whole frame, if we darken the whole frame to bring detail back to that window, kind of brings this stuff too dark. So what we can do is bring that where we want it for the kitchen. And add a linear gradient. And just bump that down a little. And just kind of find what works. Maybe we could bring a little more saturation back to those trees. And I can also rotate this as well. Get some of that effect off the floor. Just get it on the window. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so one thing we could try is to come back to, since this is a little on the blown out side, a little on the brighter side, we could try coming back to this. And this isn't necessarily the flow that I would normally take, but again, just to give several examples of copying settings from one photo to another. Paste those settings, might bring us close, yeah. And not only does that get us close to where we need to be, it also helps to keep some consistent look between photos. And so that's another thing, because the exposure was different on this, I feel like it doesn't match this exposure as well, so maybe we need to bring this up a little brighter. And you're also going to have a little bit of color difference between having the natural light coming in on this photo versus from this angle. You don't have that in the frame as much, so there's going to be some difference between the two. I think that looks really good. So let's try an auto on this one and see how that does. Let's look at, I feel like the exposure of this one might have been close. So let's copy those settings. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Much better. And I am going to bring some of that orange back in here, just for the floors. Bring it back to normal. A little closer to normal. Yeah, I think that looks really good. Let's try those same settings pasted here. Very good. So I'm going to try auto first. And although this is a completely different setting, I'm going to try and paste the settings from the kitchen because it might get us pretty close. It actually doesn't look bad. Bring these orange and yellow back in for the wood. Actually looks really good. I like that a lot. So let's copy this in case we have any more that are close that we can paste it onto. I could try this one. Not bad. I do feel like the saturation could come back down here. See that different angle. Even though I brought the saturation down, it just makes the floors actually match a little better. Even though it was the exact same settings, you get some different factors with the lighting coming in from the windows. I think that looks really good. I actually kind of liked it better before, so I'm just going to undo. And maybe we'll just tweak this one by hand a little. Brighten it up a little. Maybe we'll pull just a tad bit of the yellow down. And we'll pull the orange down just a little. I know that is a yellow bathroom, but I feel like that's probably a little more accurate. So tried auto, don't like auto. Let's try pasting the settings from the hallway. It's nowhere near close. So let's just undo both of those. And we'll do this one by hand as well. So starting out, highlights down, shadows up. Add a little bit of clarity and texture, dehaze, and just the brightness. And as you can see, most of these have done really well without even having to have any HDR processed from the brackets. So let's see what else can we do on this one. I feel like it needs to be just a little brighter. It's not bad. That's good. So let's copy these settings. See how they work on the next frame. Slightly different with the doors open. Good, but a little too bright since we got a lot of light coming in those doors now. I think that's pretty good. So let's just make those two match. Just copy and paste. Looks really good. Let's do auto on that. Still needs to bring those highlights down. Maybe bring the whole thing down. Yeah, that looks good. We'll try pasting the settings from that bedroom and the other bedroom to this one. Looks good, but it's a little too bright. A little more light coming in this one. Do the same thing. Looks good. Now we'll just get, I know this isn't going to work completely, but we can brighten it up from there. Not bad. So as you can see as well, when we went through and flagged these initially, on some of them I picked the darker frame, on some of them I picked the brighter frame, and for the most part we can achieve about the same results whether we're on the slightly brighter frame or the slightly darker frame. It's just a matter of having those options available. That's why it's really important to shoot brackets. So let's undo that real quick. So that's really blown out. Again, if this was a JPEG, there'd be no data there at all. But all we have to do is hit auto on these raws, and you still have all the carpet detail other than the sunlight actually blowing out those squares. Does look pretty good. Consistent. So we can also copy these just to make sure everything is consistent. Looks pretty good anyway, but we'll just paste that. I actually think it looked better before. Just undoing some of those. I think that's where we were. Yeah. Looks good. Let's see what auto does here. Yeah, not bad. So again, just kind of trying to do a mix of things, not just going one route in one direction on editing all these. I'm trying to do a mix of using auto, manually tweaking the sliders, and copy and pasting settings, just to really give a good overview of the options that you do have and the different results that you can get from using each different method. Okay, so that was doors open, doors closed. So let's copy these settings, paste them onto here. It's going to be a lot brighter. That still looks good. And this one's quite a bit darker. Yeah, let's undo that. Let's do auto on this one. I think that'll be pretty good. And we'll go ahead and just run the highlights and the shadows. It doesn't have to be all the way every time, but for these, seems to be working well. Looks pretty good. Let's see, I think I've got one copied that I can just paste and should get us pretty close. Yep. Same thing. And a lot of these are duplicate, somewhat redundant photos. Probably only half of what we're editing will actually get used. But I like to deliver as much as possible. And we'll let the real estate agent decide what's best. Undo that. And we'll just try auto. And then tweak the auto. Brighten it up a little. Looks pretty good. So let's take those settings. I think that's probably going to be pretty close. And we'll paste onto this. Yeah, that's good. This wall makes it look a lot more on the yellow side than I feel like it actually does when you're standing there. So I don't want to make it look like the wall's not yellow, but I just want to bring it down a little bit. That looks good. Okay, so I'm going to hit auto. It's just completely different setting. Go ahead and run these highlights and shadows up and down. I could do an HDR up here. Don't know that it's necessary. One thing I could do is boost the green saturation, so you start to see some more of the green, because there's no other green here. It doesn't matter otherwise. All that slider's doing is making those trees a little more visible. And let's see, we might brighten it up a little more. I won't brighten it up too much because it was a little on the dark side up there. Make it look pretty accurate. So let's see if we were to copy what we've got here. And throw it on this one and see what it looks like. I feel like that's way too bright. That's pretty accurate right there. Now this is going to be close. Copy and paste. Do an auto here. Tweak that. Not quite what I wanted. That's pretty good. Maybe decrease a little bit of the color. And maybe decrease a little bit of the orange and yellow from that light. Yeah, not bad. So let's see if we were to apply these settings. Might bring a little bit of that color back. Might bring a little of that color back on this one as well, just a little. Yeah, I feel like that looks good. Yeah, looks good. Try it on here, paste it. See what auto does. Yeah, not bad. Try auto right out of the gate. Not bad. Maybe just a little less bright. There we go. Let's see. Try those settings. Not bad. Maybe a little brighter. Let's do auto here. That's pretty good. Looks good. Actually, I like that better with no adjustments. We'll give it a little bit of manual adjustment. That's pretty good. So we've got other shots that we could stack brackets on this. It actually looks really good the way it is. But just for the sake of seeing it, let's jump back over to the library with this one selected. And let's look at the ones around. Okay, so here's the photo, but we still have our flag filter on, so we can't see the brackets around this photo. So what we're going to do is turn the filters off. Look at the one that's selected. This one, beside it's obviously way too blown out, but I think this one and maybe this one would be good combined. So let's just try it. So we're going to select both, right click, photo merge, HDR. We'll go ahead and merge those. And as soon as that's finished, we'll have a new file created from the merge. So it looks like that's this file right here. So don't forget to move your flag from the single shot to the HDR. That way, whenever we sort our flags later, we'll be able to find the HDR version. So let's go ahead and sort by flagged again. And we'll scroll back down to where we were. It's the garage pick right there. Double click on it. So now we'll go to develop, we've got a little bit more range with our brights, with our highs and lows. Just gives it a little more brightness in here while keeping the brick in good detail as well. And another thing we could do, if we want to keep the brightness down to keep the detail on the brick, we could bring that brightness down. And then we could do some spot changes. So let's say radial. And let's just shine a spotlight in the back of the garage there. Give it a little extra brightness. Maybe a little contrast. Dehaze. Keep those details. Maybe bring the saturation down just a bit. Yeah. Now back to our main settings for the entire photo. Gonna dial it in. Looks good. So some of this isn't fully necessary, but it's a good example of things that you can do and ways that you can improve shots like this. So now one thing that we have not done on several of these recently is to go back through and mark the stars, and I'll get in a flow of getting things where I want them to be and not marking these, which is fine as long as you have an idea of what you're going to need to come back and touch up, which I think we got to a pretty good rhythm there, that we were getting everything to a 5-star where we're not going to have to come back and look at it again. So yeah, I think we don't have to go back and do the 5-star on all of those. We'll just continue on. We've only got a couple more left after the garage photo. So let's hop back over into develop and just do an auto on this. Not bad, not much to see. I'm doing auto here. It's pretty good. I'll bring the highlights down, shadows up. Give it a little bit more detail with the textures, but maybe bring the orange and yellows down just a little bit so it looks a little more natural. Not to wash it out, but I think that looks pretty good. So let's try the same settings. We'll copy from here. Paste. This side's a little brighter, so we'll just bring that exposure down a little. So I think right about there's good, but then leaves the middle of this frame a little dark, in my opinion. So I'm just going to do a radial gradient and just get a little bit more light on this middle section. Widen it out a little bit. So I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to overdo it. You just want to get a little bit of highlight in there. Let me bring the shadows up. Bring the highlights in the shadows up. And then bring that exposure back down a little. Yeah, so that looks good. And then we can look at the before and after. Before and after. And let's go ahead and just paste those same settings over here. Oh, that looks really good. Let's see, let's tweak it a little bit though. Bring it down so we get a little more detail in the windows. Let's do another gradient here in the middle. Again, just thinking of it as a spotlight. Just adjusting slightly. And then giving it some of that clarity. Bring out the wood details in that fireplace. It's very pretty. And then I think overall, I think saturation could be decreased. So instead of, I could bump the saturation down here a little, but I don't want to do it all here. I want to get out of the spot adjust and go back into the main adjusting sliders and then start taking that out of the whole frame. Looks good. And let's just do an auto on this one. I think that'll probably work well. Yeah, looks really good. I'll tweak it a little bit. Maybe make it a little brighter so I can bring some dehaze, clarity, and texture in, because that's gonna, especially the dehaze is gonna darken it. So I'll bring it up a little, and then maybe just bring the saturation down slightly. Very good. And it looks like this is our last shot. So got just one last safety shot. Now what I can do is I can come back through here and find, just as another example, find where we were in this hallway. We do have a similar shot. Let's see what these settings look like on our last frame. Pretty good, a little too bright. Bring that brightness back down. Maybe bring these back closer to 0. But otherwise, everything looks good. So now, let's hop back over to the library. We still have our flagged filter on. So we're going to be looking at all of our photos. So let's just run through them one more time. I'm going to run through them on the library. That way I can verify that they're all 5-star, and I can make any tweaks if necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and run this up to a 5-star because I think that matches really well with the previous photo. I think all the lighting looks good. That turned out good. Several of these are where I just got on a roll and never even went through and 5-starred. Now obviously they're not all 5-star photos, but this is just, again, giving myself a visual cue and a filterable cue to show me all of the photos that are complete and ready to export. And again, just running through, making sure things look okay, making sure there's nothing that I need to adjust. making sure all of these are 5 stars. So when we filter them, they'll be ready to go. Now the quality on these aren't great because they're just in preview mode. They're loading because I'm running through them so quick, they're not even having time to fully load. So I know that the quality of these is better than what it looks like. They're just still loading. Mainly just making sure that all the exposure levels are correct. Like, so you have some patterns and stuff going on over here. More noise than what you'll see once it fully loads. Okay, we made it all the way through. So now we can sort by rated, and we can say how many stars. So if I look at the grid again, and I had 3 star, so it's 3 stars or higher. So I can also change to say rating is equal to, so it's only going to show 3 stars. So now I know we're only looking at the photos in this category, and we have no 3-star photos in this. So I know there's no photos that I've edited and haven't completed. So if I run that to 5 stars, it's going to show all of my photos. We have 67 5-star. So let's just verify, remove, turn filters off, and we'll only filter by flagged. So I have 74. So there must have been a couple that I missed. Say I didn't get a 5-star on that one. I didn't get a 5-star on that one. So just want to double check and make sure, because these are finished. These just missed getting 5 stars. So if I had have just filtered by 5 stars, and we only had 65, I think, earlier, now we have 73, there's still some missing. So I just want to turn filters off, look at all my flags, make sure, did I miss any other photos? Didn't get 5-star ratings, showing that they're completed. Editing is completed and they're ready to be exported. Yep, here's one right here. So I know I have 74 photos. Looks like I've got 5 stars on all of them. Now what I want to do is export these. So in order so now in order to export these, I can go up to File and then Export. So now in order to export these, I've filtered my flagged photos and I have all of my 5-star flagged photos visible. So I want to select one and then hold Command A to select all of those. And I can go up to File and Export, or I can right click and go down to Export. Okay, so I want to export it to a specific folder, and I'm going to choose what folder I'm going to export that to. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the folder where my other photos were. So the photo that we're working out of. We have JPEG and RAW. So now what I would do is create a new folder. And name it Final Edits. So you're going to save these into the Final Edits. So you could also do that here, giving it a subfolder, but we've already created the subfolder. So then other options, we'll just leave that. So you can rename it to a custom name. So one thing I would do is I would go into your folder and copy this again. And I would put that in the file name. So a custom name and then original file number. So that way you have the custom file name showing what property it was, but then also the original file number in case you ever need to go back and get the raw file from that, or find your Lightroom edits and find this exact file. You'll be able to narrow that down a lot quicker. So I would leave that in the file name. JPEG format, I always do 100 quality. We don't need to limit the file size. The only reason you would need to change any of this is if you're going to print, you want to have your resolution set to 300 pixels per inch if you're printing. If these are just going to be used online, your resolution does not matter. So this, you want to change this to screen. So sharpen for screen, standard amount, that's typical. And you can add a watermark. If you add a watermark, you can edit watermark and you can add just something simple down here. If you want to, you can add a image of your brand logo and it'll watermark over top of the picture. If you want to do that, this is where you would do that. For now, we'll leave no watermarks. And then post-processing after the export, we'll show it in Finder. And we'll go ahead and export. You can see the progress of the files exporting. If we go ahead and go into our folder, see the Final Edits folder, and your photos start to populate. Now we'll go ahead and show another step that I typically do when working with online websites and stuff. You don't necessarily have to do this. I think you would be fine to upload these large files to your MLS listings. But when you're working on a website, online stuff, you want to have slightly better optimized photos. So what I end up doing is I do another folder called Optimize. And then I would typically wait until all of these are exported, and then we'll pull a copy of the high quality images into the optimized folder. So we'll create a duplicate copy of those, and then open them as a batch and edit them to a much smaller size, because the size of these full quality final edits is way larger than anyone's going to typically pull up on a computer, smartphone, anything like that. You're fine having like a 1080 resolution on these, and you'll see that's 5980. That's a much larger than high definition would be. So it's unnecessary when you're looking at them online, and it'll just take a lot longer to load images of that size. If that's something you'd find helpful, leave me a comment and I'll make a video explaining how to do that. Otherwise, I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and stay tuned for more.